Yoshtek Kivanak. Good evening, everyone. I can ask everyone to take their seats now. Everyone at the back, thank you. First of all, thank you for coming to this event here at the Danube Institute. My name is Callum Nicholson. I am the Director of Research here at the Danube Institute. And at the Danube Institute, we do a lot of different things. We do events like this at the rate of about one a week. We do research papers as well. We do podcasts and so on. And what we often try and do is combine these things. So in this case, we had a visiting fellow, Dr. Simon Cottee, who then wrote a fantastic paper produced a couple of weeks ago, which you can view. If you go to the QR code, you can actually get the paper. And it's genuinely a really interesting piece of original scholarship, looking at the hard data, actually with no politics involved. It's just the hard data on what are the rates of jihadism among migrants, or what rate were migrants involved in jihadi plots in Europe over the last 10, 11 years. And so this event has combined a paper with an event. We have a podcast coming out on it as well. And we're very proud of this piece of work, so thank you for coming. And today, we're very honored to have with us for this panel, we have the writer of the piece, which we'll introduce in a minute. But first of all, I want to introduce our panelists who will be joining the discussion. First, Dr. Victor Masai, who's at the Migration Research Institute. And we also have joining us, just there's fine, yeah, perfect. Actually, go here so I can see the screen. There we go. Yeah, thank you. And also Matthias Victorian. Matthias is the host of Code Victorian, a massive Instagram channel with almost 400,000 followers, maybe more now. And he talks about the state of European culture and migration, and is increasingly an important voice across Europe in the new wave of politics on these issues. Matthias, welcome. And last but not least, and indeed come first here, is of course the writer of this paper, our colleague and my very good friend, Dr. Simon Cottee, who will be joining us online here from his home. So welcome, Simon. Thank you. Okay, so what we're going to do on this is we'll begin with, I'm just going to ask Simon a series of questions around the paper, and then we can move it out to a broader discussion. But first of all, Simon, thanks a lot for joining us. Haven't seen you for a bit. Good to see you. You're on the screen here. And can you see us, Simon?
Yeah, I can see you.
Oh, fantastic. Good. All right.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect. It's perfect.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so, and you're in that camera. Good. I'm looking at you. Okay, so, so first of all, Simon, great paper. Thank you very much for writing it. I know it was a long process, the last 7 or 8 months doing that. Before we get into it, can you just tell us a bit about your background, just to sort of set the scene here, your background academically and why, how you come to this sort of topic, before we get on to why this paper?
Yeah, well, my background is in criminology, and I trained as an academic criminologist, and I am interested in terrorism and political violence and deviance and extremist subcultures. And I'm interested in subjects that are taboo and difficult to talk about. And the migration terrorism nexus is definitely one of those subjects, and is controversial, and it interests me partly for that reason.
Great. So why did you choose this paper then? I mean, you've kind of touched on it there, but what were you seeing that you felt was not being adequately covered in the academic discussion around migration and terrorism?
Yeah, well, the prevailing narrative or conventional wisdom about jihadi terrorism is that it's homegrown, that jihadi plotters are the ordinary fish and chip eating, cricket loving, Chelsea supporting boys and girls next door who were born and raised in the West, but who became estranged from it. Now that narrative is politically coded and tends to lean left. Jihadism, or evil more broadly, doesn't come from the outside. It isn't an alien force, but comes from within the West the pathogen is us, not them. Now, I always thought that narrative was only partially right, and in some ways, I thought it was misleading. So I decided to put that to the empirical test and subject this narrative to systematic empirical scrutiny, which is what I did in the paper. And so it turns out, and one of the key findings of the paper is that there is a disproportionately high number of terrorist attacks in Europe over the past decade that involve individuals of a migration background. And in fact, I put an exact figure on it. 45% of all jihadi plots in Europe over the last 10 years involves at least one migrant. It was a very laborious process to actually arrive at that particular statistic, but it's incredibly striking, I think, and reveals a huge disproportion when you consider how many migrants actually make up the population in Europe. It's very small, yet they seem to be overrepresented in jihadi plots, foiled plots and completed plots.
Yeah.
And no one in my field is really talking about this in an honest way. In terrorism studies and security studies, the literature on this is very sparse, and it invites you to ask why that should be the case, and we can maybe discuss that later on.
Yeah, that's something I definitely want to touch on, particularly with Victor. We'll come back to that. First, you mentioned it was quite a laborious research process, and I think the way you went about this is quite interesting in itself. Can you just talk about where the data came from, how you compiled it, how you came to that conclusion? What were the sources of information? And also part of that would be almost why the paper was needed to be written. I mean, why have these conclusions not been drawn by anyone else? So
so I worked with three data sets, one on all jihadi plots in Europe since 2015, then a second one on migrant-related jihadi plots, specifically the migrant-related plots, and then a third one on migrant plotters and their demographic profiles. I started with the work of one of the foremost scholars on European jihadism, which is Petter Nesse, a Norwegian scholar. And I approached him and asked him to see whether I could use his data. And he collects it, and his data set is the most comprehensive and rigorous data set on jihadi plots in Europe over the last 30 years. It goes back to 1994, right up until 2024. So I used his data. Nesse doesn't collect material information on the migration terrorism nexus. That's not what he's interested in, but he collects core information on jihadi plots, both foiled and completed. And because he focuses on foiled plots, it gives a much fuller representation of the threat. So I started with his work and then tried to drill down into each case to find out whether a migrant plotter was involved. And so I started from that. I also drew on Robin Simcox's work on asylum seeking and terrorism. Simcox in his work had a list of, I think, 44 asylum seekers who had gone on to commit terrorist attacks in Europe. And so I also cross-checked my research with that. So that's where I started. And it just took months and months of painstaking research to to find the identities of the plotters and their background.
And when you say Europe, is that, could you just define that? Are you including the UK in this?
I include the UK, yeah, Western, yeah, what we think of as Western Europe, and I include the UK.
So there's a kind of an elephant in the room with this, is that, in a sense, why was it necessary for a paper like this to be written? You would have thought that intelligence services or policing services would have centralized this information, found this sort of pattern if it was relevant. Do you think anyone has? I mean, the UK Border Force, you'd assume, would have information on this in the UK. Obviously, Frontex in Europe. Why was this information not centralized, or if it is, why is it not publicly available?
Yeah, I think it's because it's such a sensitive subject and it bears directly on the question of immigration, which is deeply controversial. And I think there's a kind of narrative at work that says migrants, and particularly asylum seekers, are a vulnerable population, and so that any talk of them being a security threat securitizes them, demonizes them, and justifies retributive anger against them. So there is this kind of, and I think there's a strain of sentimentality about asylum seekers, and an unwillingness to confront the dark side of it, which is part of it. But I think there's this reluctance to stigmatize an already stigmatized or beleaguered group. I think it's driven mainly by that.
Thanks, Simon. Victor, when I asked him before about why this has not been so widely reported in the academic press, I mean, what's your feeling on that? Do you think it? I wasn't quite sure from your facial expression if you think it was well reported, or you don't think it is. Okay, so you would agree?
No, absolutely not. And congratulations, Simon, for this very important report. Okay, because if you try to understand the wider context why it's so underpublished and below the surface this whole topic is, it's very clear that if we examining the general framework of migration studies, this topic is always under the so-called fancy term of securitization, and then we can this demonization of migrants, etc., etc. And Simon also mentioned in his report, and if you try to focus on this topic, you can face the accusation that you're racist, xenophobic, Islamophobic, etc., etc. So it's a real stem for the deeper understanding of the whole phenomenon, and it's very evident at how hard it is to concentrate on such kind of topic. Migration Research Institute is the part of this international network for immigration research, because our understanding is that in the academic mainstream, human rights considerations, economic, sometimes social considerations are the part of the mainstream discussion on migration and migration studies, which is, okay, it's very important. But when people start to write about terrorism, crime, migration nexus, it's always sidelined. It's very hard to argue that actually still it exists, because it's also questioned by certain actors. So this is why such kind of reports are very important. And the European statistics, what you mentioned, Callum, and the whole databases are very shy, and it's very, very complicated to get relevant data. While if we compare it with the United States, the CBP statistics, they have annual reports about the border crossers, including identified people with terrorist background or terrorist checklist, criminal gang affiliations, etc., etc. So we can see that approximately 3-4% of migrants who are arriving or reaching the southwest border of the United States belong to terrorist organizations or criminal network or have serious criminal records. And it's always a little bit about this ugly mess, that we can say that, okay, let's say 3 terrorists from 100 migrants, it's still okay. But considering that one people can conduct a very serious terrorist attacks, this math is not so good for the host communities.
Matthias, there's speaking of the politics around this, I mean, often, as I think both Simon and Victor have indicated, often when you talk of migration, or when one talks of migration, simply to link it or to point out the causal linkage in some way or a statistical link in the way Simon has is seen as politicizing migration. But I'm wondering if perhaps the sort of shyness of the databases is a politicization in the other direction. What do you make of when people talk about, I mean, you're a public figure with what you're doing on Instagram and so on, and I imagine you're being told you are inciting people or it's politicizing something. What would be your view on that?
I would say that we're now at such a very important turning point in history with the survival for our civilization, for the survival of our peoples and the perseverance of our culture, that if you try to, create awareness about these subjects, that people will necessarily call you a hateful person, someone that is creating you're a fascist or you're an extremist. And but I have to say that I don't really care about these things. And I would also say that, especially me being here, that it is very important that this type of academic research, that we can also popularize this type of research, right? And I also see, let's say, a role for myself that you're all people, let's say, who write the papers, who think about the ideas. But we also need people like myself who are not necessarily, let's say, in this type of academic research, but who can, let's say, popularize these ideas. And of course, and we also need people who are in the legislative branch, who can implement the ideas that we are trying to popularize. But to answer your question, I think it's, let's say, I don't really think about these things because I just see, okay, I have a certain goal I like to achieve, and I like to contribute to that, and I don't really care about how people would call me out or what they would say. And of course, if you become, let's say, a political activist like myself, you will get a lot of you have to sacrifice a lot as well, right? So I had quite a nice job after when I graduated, and that's also something I unfortunately had to give up because of this. So I don't really think about these things too much, to be honest.
What do you think? Maybe I'll throw us back to Simon. Simon, when you're looking at this this sort of database, and the phrase that Victor just used was quite a striking phrase, the shyness of the databases, I think. And do you think that's, in a sense, a political act to be... let me draw a distinction. In the paper, you say that the reporting you've given in the paper is conservative or cautious, where you've intentionally talked through cases in the paper where there'll be someone who was a migrant and they may have done something violent, but if there's any evidence it was for reasons other than ideology, like schizophrenia, or it was or that you mentioned someone who was just a jealous lover and they'd attack someone. Now that's terrible, of course, but you didn't include that in the data. There was someone else who'd moved here as a baby, and so you didn't include that in the data because it wasn't quite what you were looking at. And so your approach to the data was very cautious, so you didn't overstate the case. Now, but that's different, I think, from people being kind of shy about the data. And so do you think the shyness of the data through front text and so on that Victor mentioned, is that itself a political, ideological act?
Yes, I think it is. And yeah, I took a cautious approach to categorization in the paper because there was there's a huge amount of migrant-related violence that I came across that I couldn't include because it didn't have an explicitly jihadi motive. But there's a huge amount of rampage violence in, say, Germany that I didn't include because it didn't have the requisite jihadi motive. But there was all kinds of violence and disorder that I didn't include. Glorification of terrorism is another thing, which is a serious crime in the UK. Many migrants have been involved in glorification of terrorism, incitement of violence, and so on. I didn't include those because it wasn't directly related to a jihadi plot. There are other cases where I just couldn't get enough information on the plot and the plotters, so I was unable to include them. there's been many cases where migrants have been deported because they've made threats, or the security services are convinced that they were planning an attack. And in some cases, I couldn't include them because I didn't have enough detailed information that a plot was in the preparation. So the actual, I think it's the problem is actually bigger. And then there's a whole issue to do with social cohesion, which this paper doesn't really touch on. And then there's the destabilizing impact of migrant-driven terrorism or migrant-driven violence. Because as we've seen recently in Belfast, it clearly matters a great deal to people what the identity of the perpetrator is. And it seems to be deeply destabilizing in European countries now. And if you see an increase in populist sentiment or far-right activism, it is at least in part driven by the reality of migrant-driven terrorism and disorder. So there is this. So when we're thinking about the migration terrorism nexus, we also have to think about how it can destabilize liberal democracies, not just the actions of migrants involved in terrorism, but also the response that this then elicits. Yeah. So I think that's an important dimension of it too. But yeah, there is a complete reluctance in my field, I think, to deal with this issue, because there's the fear of giving ammunition to the far right. That if you discuss this issue, then somehow you're helping the political right. You're playing into their hands. You're demonizing innocent people. But what are we supposed to do? Just not discuss facts because they're politically inconvenient?
So inconvenient facts. Matthias, you have a comment?
Is it necessarily a bad thing then that we help the far right in Europe? I would say it's a good thing. I would say every academic research that comes out that supports the center-right and far-right parties in Europe that are trying to save what we still have. I think that is, I would say, almost don't sell it to me. But I think that's a rather good thing, right? Why is it necessarily bad?
I don't make a judgment about whether it's bad. It's just that I think that there's a fear on the part of social scientists in particular that they're helping the far right, and I think that they would rather not talk about these issues if they feel that it can help the political right. It's just a very tribal way of looking at things. I think we need to look at the facts wherever they lead and address them accordingly.
So there is. I mean, there does seem to be sort of a chilling effect on academia based on people's worry about the politics around things. But Victor, what do you think about with academia? Have you seen a lot of evidence of? Or what's your view? Do you think academia are the facts ever really left to speak for themselves?
I think yes. Simon mentioned the numbers, some numbers, but for the audience. So during this 10-year period, there was this 100 plots, terrorist attacks, and 300 people were killed in these attacks, and more than 1,200 something were injured. So it's not just 1, 2, 3 or just a sum, but it's a lot of people. And I think it's very important that what you asked from Simon, that Simon is really following a very, very strict methodology. So this categorization is a very, very cautious categorization about the number of people who participated in this jihadi migrant attack. Because as you mentioned, for example, Simon doesn't account people who arrived just an infant, because in his concept, his opposition can argue, no, he was influenced by the European culture to become a terrorist. So, but if you are starting to count people with migratory backgrounds, or the first, the second generation people who participate in terrorist attacks, which is also a very common phenomenon all around Europe and the world. You know, these numbers, but 2, 3, or who knows how many times more. And I know one of my professors in the university has always told me, Peter Talas, one of the leading terrorist experts in Hungary, that terrorism is the pornography of security studies, because it's very easy to sell topics with terrorism. But there is also very strong linkage, this crime-migration nexus, where the numbers are much higher. There are, interestingly, perhaps more statistics about this, which more and more publicized, because simply Western societies can't, cover the phenomenon anymore. Just one more numbers, because numbers matters, and also in academic view, but also in political context. That in Germany, and it's a recent statistics from the German police and the courts, that there are 1,800 criminal cases per 100,000 German citizens. That's the number. So 1,800 per 100,000 German citizens. If we are examining the foreign-born population, this number is 4,800. And we are examining special groups like Afghan people who arrived to Germany, it's almost 9,000. So it's 5 times more than the natives. So yeah, we have to face these challenges, because if we don't address them, then, as we discussed, the far right or other extremist group will thematize this issue.
So there's a couple of questions I have. First for Simon, we've mentioned about the people involved in this, and it's very data-driven. So could you give us a sense of who is the data revealed as the type of person doing this terrorism? I mean, I read the paper, and you were saying, I think 98%, 97% were 20 to 40. But I have a kind of, well, just tell us about the data first, and I have a follow-up question. So who's doing these activities based on the data, demographically?
Yeah, okay. As I point out in the paper, there's no single profile of a migrant plotter, but there's certain commonalities. So the vast majority are male and in their 20s and 30s. The youngest was 14, while the oldest was 62. Plotters originated from over 20 countries, but the majority came from Syria, Iraq, and Morocco. Of the 137 plotters, 12% had a mental health condition ranging from the generic psychologically unstable to paranoid schizophrenia. Now, while some researchers would have excluded these cases, I, in fact, chose to include them because extremist beliefs and mental illness are not necessarily mutually exclusive and can intersect in complex ways. Some 23% of plotters had a criminal record for non-jihadi crimes, while a few had previous convictions for involvement in jihadi activity, ranging from glorification of terrorism to an assassination attempt. Most of the plotters, I think about 80% of the plotters were what I define as self-starters. So they weren't formal members of a terrorist group. They didn't belong to Islamic State. They had no real material connection to it, but they were inspired by its ideology and were radicalized within Europe. I think there's just some 10% were sent by Islamic State for the purpose of conducting an attack in Europe. And that surprised me to some degree. And I thought that ISIS would have made more use of migration routes to send in operatives to Europe. But did so in only 10% of the cases. So one question which the research doesn't really answer is how these guys radicalize. And there's a whole literature on radicalization and vulnerability and so-called risk to radicalization. You would think that asylum seekers or migrants are acutely susceptible to radicalization in some way. If you look at their social situation, that they're marginalized individuals who, in many cases, are unable to work or involved in low-wage work. You could say they face all manner of exclusion and marginalization and so on. And yet still in at the official level, governments don't really discuss this issue. And you would think that it would be an issue that the left would feel comfortable discussing. And yet that's not the case.
Though you did point out in the paper at one point that one researcher was more interested in the mental health circumstance, the mental health pressures on someone who's a lone wolf jihadi than on the consequences of his actions. Was that correct in the paper? Is that correct in my memory of that? There was a
roughly.
Yeah. It's
yeah.
There seems to be the preoccupation often with the mental health of the people conducting these jihadi activities, it seems, which seems to be, and there may be an explanation, but sometimes it feels like it's an excuse almost. Victor's got a comment on this actually. Victor, go ahead.
Yeah, and it's also a common phenomenon all around of Europe, that there is a right-wing attack automatically within a couple of minutes after it was published. It's a right-wing terrorism or radicalization. If there is a left-wing or people with migrant Islamic background, that it's still unknown reason. We have to wait the end of the investigation to tell properly what happened. So and it's all around of Europe. So so it must be changed, because it contributed that we don't know what's the real risk all around of Europe, including the UK, and how to stop it. And also it's very interesting. I just smiled, about this radicalization. That radicalization theory is very complex. There are different argumentation of how people became terrorists. But I had a discussion with a counter-terrorist Hungarian counter-terrorist official, and he told me that it's like the opening sentences of Anna Karenina, that each happy family is the same way happy, while sad families is very different way. It's also about radicalization. People is going through very, very different type, how they reach to decide to conduct terrorist attacks. And just one more issue for the methodology and to highlight why Simon research is focusing only on a very special case of this jihadi migratory attacks, that the data, if you're checking the Europol terrorism situation and trend reports, which are coming out each year by the Europol, even if the number of plots and successful terrorist attacks in Europe with jihadi backgrounds declined sharply, mainly comparing 2015 and 17. Annually, almost 300 people are arrested with terrorism-related issues. Okay, because you don't have to thinking about attacking the Reichstag building. It's enough, for example, if you're sending money to ISIS in Syria or Somalia, it's terrorist-related attack. Okay, so actually it's just again the tip of the iceberg.
Just a question from Matthias here. We just touched on the sort of what Victor said about if it's a right-wing attack, people are very quick to say it's a right-wing attack. When it's a left-wing attack, we have to find reasons. How do you feel about that? Do you feel it's a hypocrisy of how people are treated across the political spectrum?
I mean, it's quite obvious. I think in almost all major Western European countries, the media is extremely biased. So they're all, especially the state broadcaster. I'm from the Netherlands, and if there's indeed something going on the right spectrum of politics, and there is indeed somebody attacking a mosque, and it's all over the news, and it's indeed right-wing political extremism. But now we saw, of course, with the case of Henry Novak in the United Kingdom as well, that a lot of people of the Labour government were very fast, let's say, to say, okay, you know, it has nothing to do with the cultural enrichment that we currently have here in the UK. I mean, the case happened in December, and now we only see the footage coming out from the police. So I think there's a lot of bias going on in our, let's say, media playing field. And that is why it is so important for people like me who are on social media, who are trying to expose this. And I'm not the only one. But you see it now that most young people all around the West, also includes the United States, Australia, they get their news mainly from the large social media platforms, and they're not longer looking at the mainstream news, and they're looking at people like me who try to cover this type of event. So there's definitely hypocrisy going on.
One thing I've noted, obviously in the last couple of days, there's been this incident in Ireland where I think a Somali, I think it was Sudanese, was it?
Yeah, Sudanese.
Who was attacked a guy with a knife in the street. And now the reaction to that has been, even in the press, has been stronger than some previous cases. Oh, sorry, was that not clear? Okay, sorry guys. Okay, so the reaction to that particular case in the media seems to be a bit stronger than it's been for previous cases. What do you make of that case, guys? Matthias?
I think at some point, especially if so many events are happening next to each other, that also, let's say, the mainstream media outlets, at some point, they cannot go around it anymore, right? I mean, this was a brutal... this guy even tried to behead this person on the street. It was not like only a stabbing attack. He tried to behead the guy. You also saw all the riots that happened, right, straight after in Ireland. So they cannot, at some point, even they cannot keep on with the narrative that they have been feeding us, that they need to cover, let's say, this type of events. So you see this, let's say, this 108, let's say, this change in how they cover this. But I think it's still very prevalent in most Western media outlets that they are extremely biased, especially if these attacks are coming, let's say, from migrants or people from the Middle East or Africa.
Thanks. Simon, or Victor first. Victor, what do you make of that case?
Yeah, it's very interesting to say what's the point when a narrative framework is unsustainable anymore. So have a look at Germany. In Germany, definitely the Solingen attack was a turning point in the whole discourse on migration. And the more restrictionist approach started to emerge after Solingen. And there were many terrorist attacks, even before Solingen, more brutal terrorist attacks. But somehow it was the turning point when the public didn't accept anymore that, integration is in a good way, everything is okay, blah, blah, blah. So, and this is why it's hard to tell why in Ireland it was the turning point. But it's highlighting that why 10 years ago the general approach was that there's no any problem in this integration issue. There's no terrorist-related migration. It's just the securitization or politicization of the problem and the demonization by certain political groups. The European public, and not only in Hungary but also other countries, are not open anymore for this narrative. They want real answer. What's going on in their countries and in their cities?
Simon, what about your view on that recent case in Ireland?
Yeah, obviously it's a horrific case. I've been following some of the response on social media, and one leftist commentator said, well, there's been equally horrific attacks by white people against people of color. In 2015, a white neo-Nazi tried to behead an Indian gentleman. Yet, where is the outrage about this? And you could respond to that by saying, well, it's a different case when the perpetrator is an outsider, and there seems to be a lot of hostility towards our political elites for facilitating.
One second. Oh, is that better? Right. Okay, Simon, say something.
Yeah, can you hear me?
That's great. You're back. Good. Simon, can you hear us online? You can hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Oh, that's better. Okay, that's good. Right, we're back. Okay, good. Well, I have a couple of questions before we open it up to the audience. So if you have questions, just put your hand up occasionally if you do have a question, so I have a sense of how many questions we've got. But I have a kind of technical question and a broader question. The technical question is, my background's I had a degree in migration studies, background's in anthropology, and I did a master's in migration studies 15 years ago. Only in retrospect did I realize it was just it was entirely left wing. It was a bunch of Marxist philosophers talking about migration, like Stephen Castles and so on. It was quite, only in retrospect did I realize how ideological it was. But there was some interesting data you'd find as well. And I remember one piece of data I saw, it said in Spain, there was a higher rate of violence among migrants than among the native population. But, they said, you've also got to recognize that most migrants were young men, and most crime is committed not by older men or by women, it's committed by young men. So once you weighted the data by the fact that most of the migrants were young and male, the data wasn't such an outlier. It's that young men tend to be the ones, getting into fights, causing problems, and so on. And this is more violence than jihadi terrorism. But I'm just wondering, how much is the data affected by weighting it by the fact it's, generally speaking, young men involved in these things? Or does it make any difference in the context of talking about terrorism as such, as opposed to violence? Simon?
Well, I would think that it would be, that's a crucial point, right? That these are males of a certain age. It's, but there is the issue of where they're from and their ideological beliefs, right? I mean, if they're coming with talking about the individuals we're talking about, the individuals who go on to do attacks are from, in the main, are from conflict-ridden societies in North Africa and the Middle East. So it's not, although, I mean, you can say, masculinity is a thread here. There's also something to do with the particular societies from which they come, right? I mean, it's not.
Yeah.
It's not just because they're generically male.
No.
Although clearly that's part of it. Yeah.
Thanks. And Victor?
Yeah, sorry to say, but this argumentation is completely insane about this. Oh, these age cohorts, men, etc., etc. Because if it would be true, it would mean, okay, there are these 130 jihadi migrant terrorists in Europe, and comparing the age cohorts of the European population, there are, 100,000 European jihadi terrorists in the continent. But it's simply not true. We see the data. Almost half of these terrorist attacks were planned or conducted by migrant. And so, we can follow this argumentation and just telling that, there is statistics, and there are bad statistics, so this is the case. And the other point always that, and this is why we have to consider the whole migration policy of the European Union, that still we have a lot of problem also in terrorism-related issues and crime-related issues, whether we would like to import more of it to our context. And last but not least, not only the migration background, which is the mainstream migration studies try to keep the distance as much as possible, but also the cultural background issue, which also determine how some terrorist activity or how some criminal activity is working. So, for example, just to tell an example, for the Swedish police, and it's not terrorist, but it's crime related. The biggest challenge is that clan-based organized criminal network model was unknown in Sweden before 2015. But the arrival of certain nationalities to Sweden through these humanitarian corridors from the Middle East Africa brought with them this model. And it's very complicated because loyalty belongs not to the state but the clan system, And because these people are sometimes coming from countries where actually the central government and the state itself don't exist, like Somalia. These people, even with the best intention, have no idea, okay, I see this criminal clan-based network, what I should do, my loyalty is going towards the clan. For me, the Swedish state means, according my notions, as it was in Somalia, an other clan entity. Okay, they call themselves Swedish people, but they are not us, they them. So I will not go to report what's going on, selling drugs or selling weapons, because my loyalty goes to the clan, not to the concept of statehood, which is unknown in Somalia, more or less.
Matthias, this concept of cultural difference there, of loyalty to the state or the nation and loyalty to the clan, obviously your channel covers a lot of cultural differences and the nature of the West and so on. How do you see do you see there a tension here between these two different ways of organizing community?
No, especially I think with the people who are generally coming here from Africa and the Middle East, I think they come from way more tribal type of communities. Well, what we now mainly see, especially my followers, we're generally like younger people, it is also a little bit more on like some sort of pan-European movement, because it doesn't matter if I speak to people at conferences who are from Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands like me, or the UK, I think they all identify that we have like some shared European civilization, European culture, and that we all really have to work together to find a solution for the pressing problems we are now facing. Because we are now here in Hungary, of course, and Hungary is still quite of a homogeneous country, you could say. So I know probably a lot of Hungarians here in the audience. But if you are, let's say, from the UK like yourself, or me from the Netherlands, we really don't have that there anymore. I mean, I grew up in a city where I could walk around and I would hardly see any Dutch people whatsoever. If I would walk in certain streets in the city of Rotterdam, I would only see Moroccan or Turkish shops or people with headscarves or people from Africa, and hardly any native Dutch people. And I think it doesn't matter if you go to Rotterdam or to Brussels or to Madrid or to Paris, especially the younger generation, we have all see that we have the same problem. So I would also think that mass immigration, maybe one of the positive effects, you could say, maybe the only positive effect it had, that it showed us Europeans how similar we actually all are, and that we really have to unite, let's say, in this pressing fight for the future of our civilization. So I would say we see that we have more of this European shared feeling amongst especially younger people.
Great, thank you. One last question for me before we open it up to the audience. Are there any questions, by the way? Just throw your hand up. Okay, good, a few, good. So the last one I have is, Simon, in the paper you make this claim that this is the fourth wave of migration. I just want to end this panel discussion in terms of my questions, in terms of, can you just tell the audience about what are these four waves? Why a fourth wave? What were the first three and what's different about the fourth?
Yeah, this is really a reference to the work of Mark Sageman, who published a book in 2008 called Leaderless Jihad. And Sageman describes these three waves or distinct phases of jihad. And the first is the so-called Afghan Arabs who came to Pakistan and Afghanistan in the 1980s and fought in the jihad against the Soviets. He says that they were the first wave. Then the second wave consists of elite expatriates from the Middle East who went to Europe to study, people like Mohammed Atta, the ringleader of the 9/11 attacks at the Hamburg cell. He says that those elite expatriates studied in the West and became estranged from the West. And then he identifies this third wave of westernized Muslims, the so-called jihadists from next door, who were born and raised in the West, and who were, in his analysis anyway, who were marginalized in the West. But it occurs to me that there is now a fourth wave. I mean, if we accept that analysis as fundamentally correct, we can say now there's a fourth wave of jihadist violence, which is the wave of the rootless, nomadic individuals who are not from the West, but who try and pursue their migration dream in European society, and that dream somehow curdles and becomes toxic. But it does seem that there are so many of these migrant jihadis that they constitute a distinct wave in their own right. So it's really a kind of attempt to further extend on Sageman's analysis, which ends with the westernized Muslims, second and third generation. I think we need to confront the fact that many of these jihadi terrorists are actually first generation Muslim migrants. Yeah. And it's political sensitivity or political correctness that stops us from properly acknowledging this and dealing with it. And I think I think we really need to consider the security implications of mass migration. So that's really the argument.
Thanks, Simon. Okay, I want to open it up to questions from the audience. So who's the gentleman here? Have we got a microphone for the questioners, or? Oh, yeah. There you go.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matthias.
Hello, my name is Laszlo. I work for the Jewish website Neocon, and I would like to have a question to Simon. Is there a difference in attitude, in a jihadist or Islamist attitude, between those young men who have arrived in the last couple of years to Europe and the UK, and those who are already living here for many years or decades because of their parents are already citizens of the EU or UK? So is there a difference in attitude between the so-called assimilated or maybe partly integrated young men and those who are quite new in the West? I ask this because in Germany, many people from the Turkish community were absolutely outraged by what happened in 2015, the mass import of Syrian citizens, because they felt threatened. Their integrated status was threatened. That's it.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and my honest response to that is I don't know for sure. I do know that in some of the more recent jihadi plots, there has been a anti-Israeli and anti-Jewish focus on the part of these newly arrived migrants, but I think probably anti-Semitism is a thread that connects both second and third generation Muslims and first generation Muslims, however. But there does seem to be post October 7, the October 7 attacks, Hamas attacks, there does seem to be a specific focus against Israeli and Jewish targets, which is notable. But
Great. Thanks, Simon. Who else has a question? I saw a few hands up. The lady over on the far side. Thank you.
So my name is Mihai Reka, and I'm a student in international relations with a specialization in security studies. So my question would be, what, if any, are the possible solutions to this issue? And what would your policy advice be if a government or the EU, for example, were interested in managing this problem?
So policy solutions to the problem. Who wants to take that? Well, maybe all three, actually. Start with Victor.
Okay, I think the most important issue is that we have to talk about the phenomenon, and we have to be courageous enough, to speak about migration and terrorism relations, migration and crime relations, cultural background, which influences how these criminal and terrorist networks are operating, one. And the second is, ladies and gentlemen, that numbers matter. Okay, because it's also somehow the issue of integration and surveillance as well. And security services perhaps can deal with 1,000 people, they can't deal with 100,000 people. And also it's true for integration. So Germany, let's say, perhaps can integrate 10,000 or 50,000 foreigners each year, even if they are coming from Somalia or other countries. They can't integrate 300,000-400,000 or 1 million people annually. It's simply mission impossible.
Matthias, I mean, you recently spoke at the European Parliament and trying to encourage the Parliament to actually take issues seriously, which are in a sense obvious to people in the street.
Yeah.
I think your point was that they're not engaging with reality.
Yeah, so I would say the first one is a no-brainer, right? We should stop all migration coming from the Middle East and Africa. I think that's a no-brainer. Then the second point would, of course, be that we have to think about viable remigration solution. I think remigration you can achieve on 3 different levels. So first of all, we need to deport all the illegals who are here and they are, let's say, they cannot get any citizenship. So they should be deported right away. Then the second layer of remigration, I would say we really need to think about is that you have people who have a double passport. And it can be a double passport. For example, you have a Dutch passport and you have a Moroccan passport. You are committing a crime, and it's very simple. We take your Dutch passport and we send you back to Morocco. So that's the second layer. And then the third layer, and I think that's very important, is that we have, let's say, second or third generation migrants who still don't assimilate, who still don't speak the language. We still, if there's a soccer match going on, they flave the Moroccan or, I don't know, the Congolese flag or whatever. And we need to think of incentivizing these people to remigrate to their countries of origin. And a recent study that has come out about, let's say, what a low-skilled non-Western immigrant costs over their lifetime is around 600,000 euros of a net drain on the treasury. So it's super expensive. And even if we would think of incentives, of course, the incentives, they need to be lawful and in line with our European values. But let's say even if we can incentivize these people to say, okay, you get 100,000 euros to go back to your, let's say, country of origin, then it would still be a win-win situation. So I think if we really want to turn things around in the coming 5 to 10 years, that I think we have left on how to solve this issue. Because if we're only going to stop illegal migration now coming out and deporting the illegals who cannot get any citizenship, we're not going to make it, because the birth rates under the native population in Europe is way too low. The birth rates under the, let's say, immigrant populations are way too high. So we need to really think of measures on how to remigrate a lot of these second and third generation immigrants. And I think that is, especially this third layer, is one of the most important issues that we have to think about.
And Simon.
Yeah, I think I think the important thing is first to acknowledge this problem and to talk about it in an open and honest way. So that's basically what I try to do in the paper. I kind of, in some ways, I dodged the policy issue, but I think the aspiration has to be to have immigration at sustainable levels in some ways. I think we really need to think about how it's connected to security, to national security, and to try and keep immigration at sustainable levels. Whether there doesn't seem to be the political will around to do that right now, and it certainly varies from European country to country. Maybe a reform government in the UK would take this issue more seriously and be more proactive in the way that it deals with it. But I think the policy goal has to be to keep mass immigration at sustainable levels, because it is a national security issue.
It's interesting. I remember when I was studying migration, people would talk about migration as a human security issue of the migrants' well-being themselves. But if you talked about it as a national security issue, as you said, it was seen as securitizer migration, playing into right-wing tropes and so on, which has always implied that that was something inherently wrong about a more conservative perspective on it. And there's always a worry if you have a right-wing position, you end up at an extreme, whereas the left, no one ever assumed they would end up at an extreme position, interestingly. Any other questions here? I'm sure there was a couple more. But did you have a question? No? Melissa, please. There's a microphone here, 1 second.
Simon, is there any documentation as to what sociologists have been consulted in constructing a immigration program in any of the countries? Yeah, I mean, we've known for quite some time that young men commit a lot of violence, and you see an immigrant class disproportionately weighted to young men. So is there any paper trail that shows what sort of studies were there any studies that were used in constructing these immigration models? Thank you.
So is our immigration policy informed by evidence, essentially, or is it just been open the borders to some extent?
Yeah, I mean, what would that evidence be? It seems to, and if we're talking about academics, then most of them are activist liberals, right? Who are, as you say, Callum, who they're lobbyists for migrants in a way. So, but yeah, I don't know, and if there was evidence available, I wouldn't necessarily trust it. But
Victor, any final words on that?
Yeah, it's very clear that this whole border policy campaign, not only the European Union, but also the United States, was led in one side, of course, liberal, I don't know, naive liberals who want to open the borders, and of course the business community is very important. And Callum, you mentioned the Marxist literature, etc., etc. And this topic, I'm also Marxist, because, ladies and gentlemen, it's very clear who is profiting from this flow of people. Mainly the big business companies, because the guest workers, whether they are legal or illegal, is pushing down the wages. It's very clear. And a big multinational company will not deal the social consequences of 1 million plus migrants in Germany. They have to go and explain the owners whether it's their profit that quarter or not. Unfortunately it's so simple, and there are a lot of paper in the United States, more and more papers in Europe, but Matthias mentioned as well that in general macroeconomic perspectives, migration is not a silver bullet, because most migrants joining the hiring line at the bottom, and actually they are, even if they are legal, paying less tax than their social welfare cost. In general, in the Netherlands, Jan van der Beek, they did a huge research covering the period 95 and 2015, I think, and he calculated that both legal and illegal migration costed 400 billion euros net for Netherlands. Okay, so, but for a company, I see that, I have cheap labor, only 2/3 of the wages than for a native Netherlands people or Dutch people, so it's good for me. But the social cost, because there's no direct linkage. The researchers can't highlight the direct linkage between migration and terrorism. It's a debated issue. Okay, so yeah.
It does seem that often when we talk about migration, the context of it is, of course, the economic system we have. And in a neoliberal system, cheap labours and indeed open borders are encouraged because the businesses get the cheap labour and so on. So my only critique sometimes of the migration debate is sometimes it's almost too focused on migration, whereas if you look at it more epidemiologically, like a disease, disease has pathologies and symptoms. And to some extent, the thing with the migrants themselves is that the migrants themselves at an individual level, I think, are simply just people, and people I don't think are inherently pathological, but I think this pattern of what we're seeing in migration is symptomatic of an economic system which is creating these symptoms. And often the problem with symptoms in a disease is the symptoms will kill you. It's not just the pathology. So
yeah, and sorry, just one additional column that, and also it's bad for the migrant because they are exploited. Most guest workers in Italy are complaining for the condition that's going on in Spain or in different European cities. And if you are an illegal, you won't go to the authorities telling that, okay, the safety in my workplace not good enough, or the owner promised that salary, but I got only half, because, so are you working legally in the country? Oh no, then you will be deported. Yeah. So it's also bad for the migrant as well, not only for the host community.
Any more questions? No? Any last comment, Matthias?
Maybe I have one last question for Simon. You said that migration needs to be, let's say, on sustainable levels, but let's say, what are sustainable levels? And do you then distinguish, let's say, high-skilled immigrants coming from Japan to work here, or you think also we need to stop all migration coming from the Middle East and Africa, and what do you then see as sustainable?
Yeah, I think it probably makes sense to focus on to limit low-skilled migration from Muslim majority countries or conflict ridden countries. I think that maybe would be a start. Yeah, but the political question is how you actually go about doing that.
Can I just, sorry, Simon.
Yeah, carry on.
Well, I'm just going to add to that. So my family live in Cumbria in the UK, near a town called Workington. And there was something in the election in 2000. I lose track of UK elections now. There've been so many. But one of them, they talked about Workington man, and it was a classic sort of white working class chap. And the idea was, a Workington man, what would he think? And that's my local town, essentially, and Workington and Whitehaven. And it's entirely British, entirely white British working class community, a long way from anywhere. And it's one of the least privileged communities in the United Kingdom. And I think one of the challenges is when there is a lot of low-skilled migrant labor coming in, there are people who actually could have been doing those jobs, and indeed could have and then slowly maybe upskilled a little bit, who simply never get a foot on the ladder because the amount of money going into, it's quite striking in the UK, is that the amount of resources going to people not from the country when they arrive. I mean, the UK, we have a massive homelessness problem. And, if you're homeless, there are systems available, but they're not being given hotels. But if people are crossing illegally, Because I'm pretty sure if I showed up, if I went in a dinghy in the channel with my kid, the social services would come and take the kid off me for abusing the child, like taking them out dangerously on the channel. But if you cross from another country with a kid in the thing, they give you a hotel and maybe citizenship eventually. So it's extraordinary, actually, the situation. So any more questions? Comment from Melissa. Yeah, please.
If you think that's bad, the news just broke over the last couple of days that during the Biden era, illegals were provided. I don't know to what extent, what the numbers were, but a 2% loan to buy a house.
Well, if only we could all get that. Okay, so if nothing else, any final comment from you, Simon?
No.
Nope. Well, look, I just want to say particular thanks to Simon, because I know I won't go into details, but it's been, I think, a rough few months, and I'm really grateful for you having produced this wonderful paper, and wishing you well. And I'd also like to thank both panelists, Victor and Matthias. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to all of you for coming to the Danube Institute in our lovely villa here. And we have a couple more events this month that I encourage you to come to. We have one next week on how to think about climate change. And in fact, I will be speaking at that, if that's an incentive. But also Rupert Darwell will be joining us online, who's a brilliant British thinker around climate issues and the role of science in society. He'll be really, really good. And also Geoffrey Ratz and Gavin Haynes will be on the panel too, so please come to that. In the meantime, we have a Substack worth subscribing to called Based in Budapest, which is a very funny name, if you think about it. It's a very funny Substack. It's just a newsletter of what's happening in Budapest week for week, and follow our events online, YouTube, and of course our research papers as well. So with no further ado, thank you very much to all of you for coming, and thank you to the panelists.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.